and welcome everybody to the Boros Convoke Ultimate Nerd Edition. So this was something that I was doing just for fun on the side, and definitely won't be like a weekly series or anything like that because it is a fair amount of work, right? But so what I've decided to do is kind of dive into the data and explain how I use data and my approach to developing a strategy in Boros Convoke that doesn't really match up with what's happening in the tournament scene. So this may be something that you enjoy, this may be something that's completely useless to you, but I'm hoping that it's useful, and I think there's insights to be had even if you don't agree with my conclusion. So with that, let us begin. So first, what I did is I used a tracker like Untapped to look at the data of how cards have been performing in the archetype overall. And so this is right here. This is looking at Boros Convoke against all archetypes on the website, and looking specifically from February 6th, the release of Murders at Karlov Manor, and onward. And so it roughly covers, I think, about 100,000 games of Boros Convoke to bring that data in across 4.2 million matches of all of the archetypes, of everything included. So some interesting things here, right? So I covered last week a tournament winner in Japan and what cards they were running and what cards they weren't running. And so if you are completely new to the Boros Convoke archetype, you may want to start there because I'm not going to be bringing up the cards. So like if you don't know what Thalia is, go back to the other one, right? Go back in time. So we can see here that there are some cards that should be potentially considered in the archetype that I haven't seen in every list, right? So top of the list here, we've got Thalia, Guardian of Thraben, and the number one performer here against all archetypes, according to the tracker, might be worth exploring in a best of three list. Something to think about. Sanguine Evangelist, like I mentioned last week, that was one that was missing from the one in Japan, and I was like, this really should be in the list. I stand by that. I think Sanguine Evangelist should definitely be included. Lunarch Veteran is another one that I've seen being explored, sometimes in just like one or two copies. And then Regal Bunnycorn is another one that I've seen in some lists, like just as a one of, because it can be a very large threat in this archetype. And then for page 2 here, we've got the Aurelia, the Law Above. So that one started to like show up in the data, although it is a very small sample size, 1,000 compared to 100,000, right? And so this one is a new card that we got from Murders at Karlov Manor and is starting to be explored in some lists. And Brutal Cathar is also right here at the bottom of the third page here, is another option that has a very low sample size, 780, but is being explored as an additional option. So of note, later on, I will be talking about my approach here, and I want you to remember this slide because Resolute Reinforcements, Voldaren Epicure, and Gleeful Demolition, I decided personally not to run in my own approach. But for the overall breakdown of the archetype, they are very common inclusions, so I will be including them in the data as we go through the archetypes specifically. So first up here, we've got versus Esper midrange. What are the cards that have been performing very well? Case of the Gateway Express is at the very top. Yoshin Frontliner, Knight Errant of Eos, on down the list. And then we've got versus the bottom performing ones. Lightning Helix was one that I was exploring. Kumano faces Kakazan. Some lists are deciding to run it. You can see very few in the data, 220. And then Regal Bunnycorn is not doing particularly well in this archetype. And then as far as like, did I miss anything in my the total list that I was looking through? And these were all included already, so nothing particularly good there. And then if we extend things out to the all archetypes, sometimes you can get an outlier or a card that didn't have enough data, and again, this one is not particularly useful. So overall, the impressions against Esper midrange are that Case of the Gateway Express does particularly well, and so does Frontliner. And then Regal Bunnycorn, Kumano faces Kakazan, Evangelist, and Lightning Helix are all relatively on the weak side. Versus the Mirror, you've got Thalia at the top of the list here, but a small sample size. Same with Aurelia and Get Lost. And then we start to see some more of the common ones with like Sanguine Evangelist, Lunarch Veteran, Regal Bunnycorn. There's a lot of data on Boros Convoke against other Boros Convoke lists. It's a very popular matchup. And then At the very bottom here, we've got the Lightning Helix, Kumano Faces Kakazan, and Witchstalker Frenzy, which are generally best of 3 sideboards that are possibilities to bring in. So again, if we extend things for the entire list, I didn't miss anything. And then all of the best cards we got in the festivities. That one stands out a little bit more. And then nothing else specifically. So I guess there's I guess one worth mentioning is Destroy Evil. Could be a good one. The enchantment hate of Get Lost and Destroy Evil. People have been speculating about that in the mirror match. So overall, my impressions were that like Thalia, Get Lost in the festivities, and Aurelia, and maybe Destroy Evil should also have made it onto that list, are performing well in this archetype against the mirror. And then Kumano Faces Kakazan, Witchstalker's Frenzy, War Leader's Call, and Helix are all not really great options in the mirror match. Versus Domain, we've got the top of the list here is Evangelist, Kumano Faces Kakazan, Yoshin Frontliner, on down the list here. And this is another one that is pretty good as far as like what data that we actually have here. Lightning Helix and Witchstalker Frenzy are both relatively low, but they're the worst performing cards in the archetype. And then Case of the Gateway Express and Resolute Reinforcements aren't working particularly well either. As far as the alternative list goes, there's nothing here that I haven't already mentioned. And then if we extend it all archetypes, we do notice some things here. Mono Faces Kakazan bumps up to the top of the list. Witchstalker's Frenzy and Voldaren Epicure. Part of this is that, you know, mono red lists will influence this because then we're bringing in data from mono red. But still, overall, my impressions for Domain are that Kumano Faces Kakazan, Evangelist, and Frontliner are your stronger cards, whereas your weaker cards are the Witchstalker's Frenzy, the Case of the Gateway Express, Recruiter, and then Lightning Helix. And then for the Rakdos mid-range list, we've got top of the list here, we've got Witchstalker's Frenzy, Sanguine Evangelist, Case of the Gateway Express, War Leader's Call, on down the list. And bottom of the list here, small sample size again, we've got the Lightning Helix and Kumano Faces Kakazan, Lunarch Veteran, Frontliner, so some of the 1-drops, and then Regal Bunnycorn. And alternatively, did we miss anything? Everything's been covered in the list that I'm looking at. And then all archetypes, we've got the nothing really stands out here, except for maybe notice that Gleeful Demolition is particularly good in the Rakdos mid-range matchup. And we've got the Regal Bunnycorn, is doing well, kind of goes against this one, sort of. I mean, 61.8 versus 61.7, they're about the same, right? So as far as the general impressions go for the Rakdos midrange, and I should take a moment here and just take a quick pause, right? The reason why I'm doing this is to give you an overall feeling for your own strategies, right? So like if you're going through this and you're like, I've been wondering about this card over this card, I'm hoping this gives you some information about like maybe considerations as far as building your own goes. So for Rakdos midrange, the Witchstalker's Frenzy, Evangelist Express, Case of the Gateway Express, and Gleeful Demolition are all really strong cards, whereas Kumano Faces Kakazan, Lunarch Veteran, Frontliner, and Lightning Helix are poor considerations. Versus Mono Red, we can see the top of the list here is Kumano Faces Kakazan, removes things like Squee, Lightning Helix, which can deal 3 damage and then gain us 3 life, Thalia, which gives us a 2/1 first strike and makes it so that their spells like Lightning Bolt and Shock are cost 1 more. And then as far as the lowest performing cards go, we've got like Warden of the Inner Sky, does not block particularly well against mono red aggro. War Leader's Call, you'd much rather be developing the board. Regal Bunnycorn is not a great early threat and is easily dealt with like with a Lightning Bolt or a Shock. Aurelia, the Law Above, and Invasion of Gobakon are sideboard options or low data sizes that are performing particularly poorly against mono red. As far as the alternative lists go, we do have a couple here, which is why I do look at the alternative lists to see if I missed anything. And there's the Raging Battle Mouse. Oh wait, no, sorry. A Nimpakal. There we go. Sorry, my notes were a little off. So a Nimpakal is one that like squeaks in here on the alternative lists that I didn't actually include in my search overall. I don't think we're really missing anything out there as far as that is concerned. And then yeah, my bad. Notes sometimes get a little, this is a big project. I get lost every once in a while, so I ask for your forgiveness. And then as far as all archetypes are considered here, nothing really new here pops out other than like Lunarch Veteran is a particularly good counter to the mono red aggro strategies. So against mono red aggro, Mono Faces Kakazan, Helix, Thalia, Lunarch Veteran, and Cathar are all reasonable strategies to bring in against mono red. Whereas the Regal Bunnycorn, the War Leader's Call, Gobakon, and Aurelia look like they would be poor decisions to bring in against mono red. And then Golgari midrange, repeating the process again. We've got Evangelist, which is why I was surprised to have seen last week that missing that list blows my mind, because like it's one of the better cards. Case of the Gateway Express, Lunarch Veteran, and then the worst performing cards, we've got like Witchstalker's Frenzy, Lightning Helix, Kumano Faces Kakazan. Those are all relatively low sample sizes. Regal Bunnycorn, War Leader's Call, and the Ocean Frontliner. And alternative strategies, again, nothing here that comes in. And if we include everything for the Golgari midrange, we do see Get Lost and Destroy Evil bump up to the top of the list here. So overall, strong inclusions against Golgari midrange are the Evangelist, Case of the Gateway Express, Get Lost, and Destroy Evil, whereas the Witchstalker's Frenzy and the Helix and Kumano Faces Kakazan and the Regal Bunnycorn are relatively weak options. Then against Dimir midrange, Evangelist again at the top of the list, Case of the Gateway Express, the Ocean Frontliner, on down the list until we get Kumano Faces Kakazan and Lunarch Veteran are poor but low sample size, Regal Bunnycorn, War Leader's Call, and then Voldaren Epicure. Alternative lists here, not listing anything new. And if we increase everything to include everything, to include all archetypes, we can see that the Ocean Frontliner does particularly well against the Dimir midrange. And so Case of the Gateway Express, Evangelist, and Frontliner are going to be your strongest cards against the Dimir midrange strategies, whereas Kumano Faces Kakazan, Lunarch Veteran, and the Regal Bunnycorn are going to be weaker options. And then last here, we've got the Azorius Control matchup, and surprisingly, Lunarch Veteran is coming in at the top of the list here. And that one caught me off guard, because you generally think about Lunarch Veteran against mono red, right? Because it gives you that extra life gain. But the more that I thought about it, Azorius Control can kind of struggle against Lunarch Veteran because it is something that comes back from the graveyard. So if they're doing Wraths like Depopulate, Lunarch Veteran can then come back as a flyer, and the disturbed aspect of Lunarch Veteran can be something that I think is maybe underlooked as an option in the list. So if you're coming up against a lot of Azorius Control, you may want to explore bringing up the amount of Lunarch Veterans, and then you get the bonus that if you come up against mono red, you've got a good card against that as well. Yeah, and then on down the list, we've got Evangelist, Witchstalker's Frenzy, Lightning Helix, and then bottom here we got Case of the Gateway Express. Very low creature count for us to actually hit with the Case of the Gateway Express. Similarly, Get Lost, really not a lot of targets for that to hit. Ocean Frontliner, and Kumano Faces Kakazan. So alternative strategies, there is a note here for the Restless Bivouac. That one is one that I think we could include in some of the mana bases. You have to be careful with it though, because having a tap land can really screw up your turn 1, turn 2, turn 3. But I've been exploring bringing one into the mana base, as I will cover here shortly. And as far as all of these are concerned, all archetypes are concerned, then we get some contradiction in data, right? So Kumano Faces Kakazan jumps to the top of the list here, and this I think has to do with mono red being particularly good against Azorius Control. And so I'm once again more likely to believe the earlier data that Kumano Faces Kakazan is not good in this archetype. And nothing really comes out here except for maybe a Destroy Evil. Again, it's a relatively low sample size, not something that I'm going to read in too much to in this archetype. And so we're looking at Lunarch Veteran is strong against Azorius Control, surprisingly. Evangelist, Witchstalker's Frenzy, which is another one. There are some things that need to be removed in Azorius control, so despite them having a very low creature count, the Frenzy can still work to get over the incubator tokens, 2/2s off of the Wandering Emperor, etc. And then Bivouac, I think, is one that you might want to consider, depending on how much you're coming up against Azorius control. You don't want to be bringing in Kumano Faces Kakazan, Case of the Gateway Express, or additional copies of Get Lost. So, my overall impressions of going through this deep dive, the Ultimate Nerd Edition of Boros Convoke, is that Frenzy, Kumano Faces Kakazan, Thalia, Festivities, Get Lost, Destroy Evil, Helix all have data. There's a small amount of data for Aurelia and Cathar, not really enough to say too much on. But we do see common sideboard options that didn't show up in the data while I did this, like Lithomanic Barrage, Invasion of Gobakon, and Lantern Flare. And now that's not to say that they are bad, right? It's just that there's a lack of data, so I can't really say what the data would suggest. As far as what is being considered the main core of the deck, so at least 4 copies of, we've got the Novice Inspector, the Warden of the Inner Sky, Knight Errant of Eos, Imidane's Recruiter, Gleeful Demolition, Voldaren Epicure, and Resolute Reinforcements. Those are all 4 copies, generally in most of the lists that I've come across, whereas for the 3 or less option, I've seen Evangelist start to make it into some lists, some not. Regal Bunnycorn, War Leader's Call, and Case of the Gateway Express generally fluctuate between 2 to 4 copies, and then Lunarch Veteran is being explored, as well as multiple copies of the Frontliner, Yoshin's Frontliner. So, with that, though, now I'm going to turn it over to what I decided to do, which is a little bit off the beaten path. So now that we've covered all of the basics for the Boros Convoke deck and what's been working in which archetypes and everything, what I've decided to do is take my own approach, and it's based off of the top performing cards overall. So if you go back at the very beginning and you look at all archetypes, the first 3 pieces of data, basically everything after the Resolute Reinforcements I decided to cut. So no copies of the Resolute Reinforcements, no copy of the Voldaren Epicure, no copy of the Gleeful Demolition, and this is instead leaning more heavily into the white cards, which I think across the board have been overperforming. And yeah, it's an exploration, right? Because your Gleeful Demolition is kind of largely considered a core part of the deck by many, right? And same with the Voldaren Epicure, but I don't think that they're actually necessary. So I'm going to do my best to convince you about why I took this approach. And as far as the lands go, I am running the Thran Portals. I wanted, despite not having the Voldaren Epicure and the Gleeful Demolition, I still wanted the ability to have a turn 1 red source 90% of the time. So I decided to keep the lands relatively the same. And I did bring in 1 Restless Bivouac over the Sundown Pass. So some copies are running the Sundown Pass. So I'm not sure that I'm 100% sold on this being the end-all be-all best version of the deck mana-wise, but it has been working for me on the latter. And then as far as the sideboard goes, I've decided to run the 4 copies of In the Festivities, bring in an additional copy of the Case of the Gateway Express, as well as the War Leader's Call, play around with that, 3 copies of the Witchstalker Frenzy, 4 copies of the Kumano Faces Kakazan, and then 2 copies of Thalia, Guardian of Thraben. So with that, I'm going to go specifically into the thought process of my approach here and what my sideboard strategy is against the most common matchups in the tournament, in the best of 3 tournament scene. So against Esper midrange, what we're going to want to do is bring in 1 copy of the Express and 1 copy of the War Leaders, all from the sideboard. So there are a couple of matchups where having 4 copies of the Case of the Gateway Express is really good, and sometimes not. So I'm playing around with the idea of being able to fluctuate between having 4 copies of the Gateway Express and then 4 copies of War Leaders, sometimes 4 copies of both, depending on the matchup. And so that's why I'm running 3 to start, because they definitely are a little bit matchup dependent, and then we can kind of tweak it from there depending on whether or not it's a good matchup. And then as far as the worst performing card in the list, we've got Regal Bunnycorn coming in at the bottom here, as long as I'm not bringing in the 4 copies of the Kumano Faces Kakazan. And then as far as alternative strategies, I just want to showcase this, that like, despite having Gleeful Demolition and Voldaren Epicure and the Resolute Reinforcements removed, that I just wanted to make sure that they weren't among the top 8 performing cards within the archetype. So we can see here that we're good to go, not really missing anything as far as what I've taken out. And then as far as all archetypes go with the same list of cards, there is one here that could be a potential good inclusion, and that's Thalia, Guardian of Thraben. So my strategy against Esper midrange is to bring in the War Leader's Call, the Case of the Gateway Express, the 2 copies of Thalia, and sub out 4 copies of the Regal Bunnycorn. In the mirror match, we can see the top performing card here is Thalia, so we're going to bring in the 2 copies of the Thalia. And then as far as the worst performing cards not in the sideboard, we've got the War Leader's Call, as well as the Case of the Gateway Express. So especially after our opponent is going to bring in Enchantment Hate, like Get Lost, it's kind of fun in game 2 to be like, oh, now I don't have any, and they don't work particularly well anyway in the mirror match, regardless of the additional hate, just because your opponent is going to, it's basically a race to see who is going to be able to get the Convoke strategy to pop off first. And note here that the Gleeful Demolition is something that, in theory, should help you in that matchup. Now, looking at the top 8 cards in, this is not specific to the list I'm looking at, this is just as the archetype as a whole. Notably, they're not missing here. So I think that there could be something to the strategy of ditching the Gleeful Demolition. And so that's partly what, like, while I was going through this data, I had that idea and was like, all right, well, maybe it's worth exploring. So if we do the extend the filter to include all archetypes, we can see that the End of the Festivities comes here at the top of the list. So we're going to want to bring in the 4 copies of the End of the Festivities. So my sideboard strategy here for the mirror match that I've been using on the best of 3 ladder is to bring in the 2 copies of Thalia and then the 4 copies of In the Festivities, and substitute out the 3 copies of the War Leaders as well as the 3 copies of the Gateway Express. Versus Domain, we can see here that Kumano Faces Kakazan is a low sample size, but a potentially good thing to bring in against Domain. And that War Leader's Call does well against the slower matchup as well. So we're going to bring in the 4 copies of the Kumano Faces Kakazan from the sideboard, and then 1 copy of the War Leader's Call. And we're going to take out 3 copies of the Case of the Gateway Express, not bring in the Witchstalker Frenzy from the sideboard. And then as far as checking for missing cards in the alternative list, again, nothing shows up here for the red cards that I removed, as well as Resolute Reinforcements. And against Domain here, we've got, for all archetypes, we can see that Witchstalker's Frenzy is doing quite well, but that might be because of the mono red. We know that mono red does relatively well against Domain. So my plan here is not to touch the Frenzies, although I guess we could, but instead lean in towards taking out the Recruiter. And it's a little bit of a question mark, right? Just because Imidane's Recruiter is definitely like a core part of the deck. Against Domain, it works a little bit less well because of how many Wraths that list is running. So I have tried it taking out the Imidane's Recruiters, and it has worked. Notably here, though, Witchstalker's Frenzy, low sample size, but it's the worst performing card on the list. So this is something to keep in mind when you're looking at the all best archetype. There can be things that come in from additional things like mono red. So I'm more likely to trust the 100 sample size that Witchstalker Frenzy is not good against Domain, rather than the one here saying that Witchstalker Frenzy is very good against Domain. And it does kind of depend on what you're going to come up against, right? Because like Topiary Stomper isn't a blocker until they get to 7 mana. But once they do start getting Topiary Stompers online, you could use the Witchstalker Frenzy to remove it. So I could see an argument going either way. Personally, I'm not going to try bringing in the Frenzies. I'm going to bring in the 4 copies of the Kumano Faces Kakazan and the 1 more copy of the War Leaders all. and then cut the 3 copies of the Gateway Express. I just don't think that it's a very useful removal target for the enchantment, and then if it gets removed by like a ley line or whatever, you don't get the +1/+0. So, and then take out the 2 copies of the Recruiter. So we're not going to fully cut all of the Recruiters, but we're going to cut the Recruiters down by half. As far as the Rakdos mid-range strategy goes, we can see Witchstalker's Frenzy here at the top of the list. So I'm going to bring in 3 copies of those. Case of the Gateway Express, going to bring in 1 copy there, as well as 1 copy of the Warleader's Call. So this is another one where having both 4 copies of the Gateway Express and 4 copies of the Warleader's Call, I think, is advantageous. And then as far as the worst performing cards in the archetype, we don't want to bring in the Kumano Faces Kakazan. We can take out the 4 copies of the Ocean Frontliner, as well as 1 copy of the Lunark Veteran. And then again, checking just to make sure that there's no important cards that are missing from alternative lists. And we can see that Gleeful Demolition and Voldaren Epicure and Resolute Reinforcements are not on there. And then as far as all archetypes go, we can see that Sanguine Evangelist is at the top of the list, but nothing really here stands out as far as a sideboard option. So I'm going to bring in the 3 copies of Frenzy, 1 copy of Gateway Express, 1 copy of the Warleader's Call, and cut the 4 copies of the Frontliner and the 1 copy of the Lunark Veteran. And really just lower the amount of 1-drops. It's not important against Rakdos midrange to really pop off and convoke as soon as possible. So that's another thing that, like, I think the Gleeful Demolition into turn 2 Knight Errant of Eos is nice when it happens, but it's an inconsistent strategy. It requires a lot of parts for it to actually work. And it's somewhat relatively easy to respond to, right? Like if your opponent does like an End the Festivities and wipes all of your 1/1s that you did with the Gleeful Demolition, then you're not getting the value out of it immediately, right? So I think it's okay. And playing the deck, I've experienced being able to still get Convoke value off of my Knight Errant of Eos, less so doing the turn 2 into a turn 3 Recruiter. So it does slow the curve down, but I haven't found that to be too detrimental. And Rakdos midrange is definitely one where it's not a problem. Versus Mono Red Aggro, we can see the top of the list here is Kumano Faces Kakazan, so we're going to bring in the 4 copies of the Kumano Faces Kakazan, and that works really nicely so that when we trade up against Squee, that it's exiled forever and doesn't keep coming back from the graveyard. We're going to bring in 2 copies of Thalia, which the first strike works nicely to block our opponent's Swift Spears and 2 toughness creatures. Bring in 1 copy of the Express, Case of the Gateway Express. I've liked this one because, like, yeah, you know, you're removing your opponent's stuff and then attacking in is usually better than blocking with Monstrous Rage and such meta. And then we're going to bring in the 3 copies of the Witchstalker Frenzy for the same reason, just being able to remove our opponent's key pieces, whether they be Godric's or Squeeze or whatnot. We're going to attack and then try to win the race by removing their pressure. And then as far as the slower, or the cards that I want to take out for this archetype, I'm going to take out the 4 copies of the Regal Bunnycorn. They do not work well early when you haven't developed your board already. And then they're very prone to dying to things like Shock. And then the Warleader's Call is just too slow. I'd much rather be developing the board and using something that I can block with. And then I'm cutting out the 3 copies of the Warden of the Inner Sky. You just can't afford to tap your own creatures, and a 1/2 does not pair up very nicely against the mono red stat blocks or stat lines. As far as the alternative strategies go, there are a couple of, like, a Nimb Call and Lightning Helix are both on this list, which I mentioned previously last week about, you know, if you're really struggling against mono red, you could explore those options, especially the Lightning Helix. But because they're not really great in any other matchup outside of mono red, I decided to remove them from mine. But notably, no Gleeful Demolitions, no Voldaren Epicures, and no Resolute Reinforcements. And then if we extend the filter for all archetypes, again, nothing in particular stands out that we haven't already seen in the previous lists. So my sideboard strategy for Mono Red Aggro is to bring in the 4 copies of the Kumano Faces Kakazan, the 2 copies of Thalia, the 1 Gateway Express, and 3 copies of Witchstalker's Frenzy, and take out the 4 copies of Regal Bunnycorn, 3 copies of Warleader's Call, and 3 copies of Warden of the Inner Sky. Versus Golgari midrange, we can see here that we should bring in 1 more copy of the Gateway Express. And then as far as what we should take out. If we're not going to bring in the Frenzy or the Kumano Faces Kakazan from the sideboard, then we can drop 1 copy of the War Leader's Call. Again, checking the alternative lists for cards that were not included in my search, we can see again, not any of the 3 that I decided to cut. So hopefully I've convinced you by now that they may not be necessary for the strategy. And then as far as all archetypes go here, again, nothing that we haven't seen already in the data above. So it's a minor change for Golgari midrange, but it's a very favorable matchup anyway. Take out 1 War Leader's Call, bring in 1 Gateway Express. Versus Dimir midrange, which is another very favorable matchup. We can see here that we're going to want to bring in 1 copy of the Gateway Express, as well as 1 copy of the War Leader's Call. And then our weakest cards, if we don't bring in Kumano, is the Lunarch Veteran. So again, alternate list, nothing really missing from this strategy. Same with if we change the filter size to include all archetypes instead of just Boros Convoke specifically. And so my strategy here is bring in the 2 more enchantments and cut out the 2 Lunarchs. We don't really need as much life gain as we do against like Mono Red, and we don't necessarily need the 1-drop as much because they do have a fair amount of disruption in this strategy. So you're going to tweak a little bit more towards a little bit later with the War Leaders grinding things out. And then Azorius Control here, you can see that this would be a good matchup to bring in the War Leader's Call. Generally, the more controlling archetypes struggle a little bit with the War Leader's Call because they might be able to wrath your board, but then every time that you're bringing in a creature, it's dealing 1 damage to their face. And also 3 copies of the Witchstalker Frenzy. And this one might come as a surprise to some. It is a low sample size, but I do believe that the Witchstalker Frenzies are good bringing in here because we've seen things like the Play with Fire as a sideboard I mentioned last week, and being able to target the few creatures that Azorius Control does create, Witchstalker's Frenzy can help with. So eliminating the Incubator token off of Sunfall, eliminating a 2/2 off of the Wandering Emperor, and in a pinch, eliminating a 1/1 off of Sunset Revelry. So although the list isn't running any creature spells in the main, Azorius Control still has some targets where I think Witchstalker Frenzy can be applicable. And then as far as the worst cards go, we can take out the 3 copies of the Case of the Gateway Express. They may be running creatures, but not enough to reliably count on having something to remove with the Gateway Express. And our board may be very small with how many Wraths the Azorius Control is running. And then we can also bring out 1 copy of the Yoshin Frontliner. And as far as the alternative cards go, excuse me, we do have one here that I think is worth a mention, which is the Restless Bivouac. I decided to include the Restless Bivouac because of this data right here, that it is the top performing card in the Boros Convoke archetype overall. So that was why I decided to take out the 1 Sundown Pass for the Restless Bivouac. If Azorius Control is an issue going forward, there may be additional stuff that we could explore, like bringing in the Urabrask's Forge. Could be, I've seen some lists running that against Azorius Control because then it requires them to both sweep low and high. And then as far as the all archetypes go, again, this is another one that there's just not anything that we haven't seen already. So my strategy for the Azorius Control matchup has been to bring in 1 copy of the War Leader's Call, 3 copies of the Witchstalker's Frenzy, 3 copies of the Case of the Gateway Express, as well as 1 Yoshin Frontliner. So if you made it to the end here, thank you so much for listening to my thoughts on Boros Convoke. This was definitely a deep dive and something that I personally did because I wanted to run some experiments for the Boros Convoke archetype since it is kind of new and I have a lot of data on it. So as always, please let me know what has been working for you in the archetype specifically. Let me know what you think about if it's absolutely crazy to be cutting the copies of the Gleeful Demolition and Voldaren Epicure, or if you think there might be something to it. Sideboards always make interesting discussions, so remember to hit like and subscribe for more near daily Magic the Gathering content, and good luck crushing your matches or RCQs.